Keeshia Pettit, good to have you back.
Thank you. It's lovely to be back.
The last time we recorded, be it over 2 years ago now, is the
that
last
2
time
years
we've seen
ago?
each other. No, sorry, a year ago. I'm
Okay.
adding years. But it's been over a year since I've seen you. And we've made an effort, I feel like, a couple times since.
I feel like you've been really good in making an effort and I'm the one who's dropped the ball.
But in credit to you, my effort is, hey, I'm in Sydney for the next half hour.
That's the only way that you can do things with me though. I'm so
Yeah.
last minute that if there's 3 or 4 weeks worth of planning for a catch up, that just stresses me out. But I feel like, we make the joke that adulting is just saying, oh, this week's so busy, next week will be better. And I feel as though I've said that to you quite a few times. So I'm sorry that I've dropped the ball on the catch ups.
No apology needed. You have been busy though, because life has taken twists and turns for the better in something I've been saying to you for the longest time, ever since we first had our chat. I feel like you really deserve to be in the limelight because you are so good at what you do. You're a brilliant host. You're an unbelievable conversationalist. And you're so switched on with what you do. And you've just released your new series, Cloud.
Thanks.
And not only released it, but just teased a bunch of really big name episodes. That is so exciting. It's hit the charts. It's absolutely on a roll. Tell me about it.
Thank you. It's for anyone who doesn't know, it's a new mini-series that we've dropped under Life Uncut Productions, and it's a conversation about ADHD. And before everyone rolls their eyes, I know that there's a lot of eye rolling that happens in that particular space at the moment, and I get it, because there's so much social media coverage, and there's still the kind of question mark of like, what is this? And so many people are saying that they've got it now, and everybody thinks they've got ADHD now. But I was diagnosed it'd have to be nearly 2 years ago now. And I found that there was a lot of conversation about, this is what it is, or this is how you explain it to people. And then I was kind of like, okay, so like, what am I supposed to do with that? Like, I've got all of this information, and for a lot of particularly late age diagnosed women, because our understandings of what ADHD is has evolved so much, a lot of us can go through this kind of weird identity, this question mark of, I thought that was a personality trait. As it turns out, it's actually a symptom of this condition. And for me, being medicated meant that quite a few of those things kind of softened. Things like impulsivity, things like my need for novelty, things like, my scattiness and my emotional reaction to certain things, that really softened. And I was like, oh, that's a bit strange. I thought that's who I was. But as it turns out, maybe it was this thing. And so I was like, okay, how am I supposed to kind of do the next steps? What am I supposed to do with all this information and make it into a good thing? And not in like a toxic positivity way, but, you and I are both aligned on the fact that we're always trying to aim for self-improvement and making our lives better. And so I decided that, we wanted to have some conversations with people who are super successful, and whether that be successful in the traditional sense of like, we spoke with Mark Manson, who's sold over 20 million copies of his book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. But I also wanted to speak to people who have had success in making their life, like inner peace successful and present with their friendships and their relationships successful. So that was kind of the why behind why I wanted to make it. And I'm very, very fortunate enough to have a really beautiful friendship. It's like an internet friendship. We've actually never met in person, but with Mark Manson's co-host and producer, Drew. So I became friends with him because I was listening to Mark's podcast a while ago, and I realized that we had quite a few similarities in our stories. Like, I have a medical research background as well, and then I found myself in podcasting, and I was like, that's quite a niche trajectory, right? And so I reached out to Drew and I was like, I just really enjoy, your content and your newsletter and blah, blah, blah. And we became friends. And so I think that he was really the reason that connection with Mark was able to be made. And Mark was the second episode of the podcast. And it's really funny. Like, I feel in this industry, once you get one person who has a profile like that, the other people you reach out to are like, oh yeah, sure, that sounds great. Like, if that person's keen to be involved, absolutely. And so kind of the dominoes just ended up falling, and I was able to have conversations with people that, were like best case scenario for me, and people that I dreamed of and have learned so much from already. And I was like, oh, this is a really cool moment that now I'm the person who gets to speak to them and and learn from them. Also, it's quite interesting to me that I didn't know that most of them had ADHD until I did some, work into their space. And I was like, oh, hang on a second.
Yeah.
Maybe you too.
One of the things that happens on the internet is we see it with ADHD and also even in the modern era with autism, because there are plenty of examples of people who possess those kind of behavioural traits that have gone on to be successful. And so we then attach the medical diagnosis to those things somewhat humorously to say, hey, like, I've got that trait too. There's that meme that goes around online about, I wish I had the kind of autism that made me a billionaire, not interested in trains, right? Like, there is like those memes.
So true.
There's those memes that go around. And that's one of the things that I found really interesting. So when I listened to your first episode and you introduced the series, I think because you're such a happy-go-lucky kind of person, like I've never had a chat with you where you didn't find the positive side of whatever we're talking about. And I think that when you're happy-go-lucky and you've got a very optimistic outlook on everything, you can kind of brush over symptoms or challenges and just weave them into some kind of positivity. But rather, there's probably a bigger story behind it. And I know that because of the modern world that we live in with socials, a lot of maybe the behavioural traits of ADHD are things that can come on from people spending too much time on their phone or being a little bit more disconnected from their sense of self and a little bit more distracted by everything that's happening around us, that it can actually, for people who have ADHD, be overshadowed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's actually a conversation that I had with a guy called Johann Hari on the podcast, which will come up in a couple of weeks.
He's brilliant, by the way.
Yeah, I've actually been friends with Johann for probably 8 years now. I initially met him because when I was in medical research, my research was in genetic factors of addiction, and he had written his book, Chasing the Scream, on addiction, which kind of looked at more the behavioural and like social constructs about addiction. But one of his more recent books, Stolen Focus, Why We Can't Pay Attention, examines things like the tech industry, like the food industry, and how all of these systems around us are now designed to take our attention, and how attention is kind of a commodity. You think about an algorithm on social media, it's probably the easiest way to think about it. The longer they keep you scrolling, the more money they can make because they can serve you ads, or do you know what I mean? So we are in a system now that is particularly dangerous if you're someone who doesn't have as much control over where you direct your attention. But definitely everyone is in that system, everyone is feeling the effects of that now. And to your point about, if you have ADHD and I want to try and find the positives in that, it's sometimes a hard conversation to balance because some people will see ADHD as a superpower. The people who are particularly entrepreneurial, a lot of people in media, because we have inbuilt novelty in our jobs and we've found a way to kind of direct that into being a good thing. But there is another side of that seesaw, and it's kind of like an ableist conversation, and it's involved with capitalism and how much, having a condition like that, you're expected to turn up in society and be productive and be able to work the 9 to 5. And for some people, that's a lot harder than what it is for others. And I feel fortunate in the sense that I have found a job where that wasn't required from me, and so I do have a lot of empathy and sympathy for the people who are not able to see it as a superpower, and they're like, actually, this is really debilitating for me. And hearing conversations like the ones I have may be frustrating because they're like, well, yeah, it's fucking nice to turn up and be able to go and have fun at your job and stuff. That's not the reality I live in. That's not the version of this condition that I live with. So I am conscious of that, and I'm trying to kind of include that conversation as much as I can because I do see both sides of the coin,
Yeah, I get you. I get you. It's interesting because you spoke about before your medical research background and genetic factors of addiction. I wonder if you've looked into, and I'm sure you probably have, the genetic factors that influence a disorder like ADHD, because I found it interesting in the first episode you mentioned that unless you can find evidence of these kind of symptoms prevalent in someone before the age of 12, then you can't get a formal diagnosis. I found that interesting because what is it about that somewhat formative age, I guess, from a doctor's perspective that makes that important?
I don't specifically know. I mean, you'd probably have to ask a psychiatrist, but there are quite recent studies that show that there's about 100 genes potentially involved in the development of ADHD. And it comes into epigenetics as well, which is kind of like the turning on and turning off of certain genes. And so that's kind of the current theory. There are a couple of things that basically say most of those genes are involved in things that have to do with the prefrontal cortex, which is where you have a lot of your like emotional regulation and your thought processing, and executive function is the words that they use in science a lot. And it shows that there are different levels of certain neurotransmitters, or some studies show that there's potentially different blood flow to those areas. There's a few things going on at once, and no one's really said this is specifically what it is.
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because you wonder, without you disclosing the full transcript, I should say, of the Johann episode, did he allude to any of the social conditions that can some of those social conditions actually trigger the turning on of genes that then bring ADHD to life in somebody, or just bring it closer to the surface?
Yeah, the main one that he wrote about in his book was basically like familial trauma. So if you have a parent who is not a parent, there's been psychiatrists and researchers who have found that abandonment can really exacerbate ADHD. And it also, again, this seesaw of like, well, does that mean that it ever existed, or was it actually just, the environment that the kid was in? It kind of puts that into question, which can be hard when you're diagnosed to kind of accept that that is a part of the conversation. It's very invalidating. It absolutely would be the case that certain environments could exacerbate the symptoms. I don't think it can cause it though, because it's a genetic cause, and there's about a 70% inheritability of ADHD.
It's a weird world we live in, right? I feel like people feel maybe more challenged than they have in a long time because of current social factors and the way that we all exist. I was even speaking about this last night. It just changes in the recent Instagram algorithm, right? People may notice that the people who you follow, you don't see their stuff as often because things have changed. It's now developed similar to TikTok, where the algorithm is rewarding virality. And so you think, well, hold on, that's not why I liked Instagram. I liked Instagram because there were people I chose to follow and I wanted to consume their stuff. And there were also people who chose to follow my stuff that wanted to consume it. And now I've got to make things even more engaging, baity, clickable. You think from a business perspective, that's not what most people listening to this conversation will be thinking. But from a consumer perspective, if every business is now catering their content to be more baity, and now your behavior is becoming more baity and you're being baited more often, it just changes the way that your brain is wired.
It also, there's been so many studies that have shown that outrage culture not only grows a following, but it elicits such an emotional response in you as a consumer. So going through the algorithm, that's why they preference outrage culture. And I'm so fucking over it.
Yeah.
There are certain things that happen on our podcasts, and I know that if I was to cut that clip and put it on social media, I know it would blow up. And I'm now in a position where I'm like, I'm not doing it. I'm not buying into this anymore. I am so sick of this deliberately emotional, reactive kind of conversations that happen online. And you see it with a lot of people, particularly in Australia now. I mean, we've seen it in America for a long time, but I think Australians have cottoned onto it. They will say something particularly inflammatory. They know it's going to kick off in the comments. They know it's going to be shared. And there's a direct correlation there. People financially profit off of that. Whether you hate follow someone, whether you comment on it because you're against them and you want to argue with them, that increases their engagement. They are then able to use that engagement as, hey, my stats are really good. Do you want to do a brand partnership with me? I have, 13% engagement on every single one of my posts. And a brand goes, yeah, absolutely. That following continues to grow. They continue to make more money from it. They are incentivized to bait you. They are incentivized to make you angry, because there's been research on this as well. You will engage with content that makes you angry far more than you will engage with content that makes you happy. And I don't know about everybody else, but I'm exhausted by it. Like, I simply refuse to follow those accounts now. I refuse to engage with it because I know what they're doing. And we're about to come up into an election. It's going to happen here. We saw it happen in America. It's exhausting. And, you know, obviously we're so, you know, you and I are so involved in that world that we probably see it a little bit more transparently than what I think most people would, because we also operate on the other end of it. But I really hope that the fog of the intention behind why people make content like that starts to clear. It's not designed to make us feel good. It's not designed to make us informed either. And that's something that I find particularly tricky, is that a lot of people do content like that under the guise of, no, I'm telling you, you know, I want you to be informed about the fact that this is happening. There may be percentages of the time that that is true, but I don't think that it's the majority. I think that the intention behind it is to fuel a reaction in you and grow their own presence. That's my take. Look, some people might agree, and people who do it might be like, that is absolutely not my intention, and how dare you say that it is. But yeah, my take is that the majority of people are creating content for that reason.
I tend to agree on that, and I feel that, you know, it's just interesting you mentioned the election. There's already, I've seen David Pocock.
Yes.
So I really like David
Senate,
Pocock. Yeah, he is. He's senator down in Canberra. I really like the guy, probably because he's a gun athlete, but also because he seems to have very reasonable views on a lot of things. Now, I don't think there's any politician that I look at and completely agree with everything they say, right? But that's beside the point. I don't think you're ever going to find that person. Probably dangerous if you do, because they're just speaking to what they want people to hear, right? As opposed to what they truly believe. But it's interesting, he mentioned yesterday in this clip, he showed a clip of one side going at the other side going back at them. He's like, if you can't tell, it's an election year. And I'm like, that's just social media as a whole now. And I am so like you, I'm exhausted by it.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that yelling at one another gets us anywhere. It's like, he actually, in that same video, Pocock quoted somebody that he's inspired by. I can't remember who it was. And he said, the quote was, if you're yelling at each other, your argument isn't strong enough. I'm like, oh, isn't that interesting? When did we lose that place where you're coming from a position of strength and you believed in what you said and you could say it in a composed manner without trying to outrage everyone else? I just feel like we've lost that. And I think that it's making us all a little bit more sensitive to the things we see and feel, and we naturally all have a bit more of an emotional reaction to that kind of outrageous content.
Yeah, I kind of wonder whether it's the chicken or the egg. Like, we have become so polar. I mean, we just saw it with the American election. Kamala Harris was the one who said, you know, we have a lot more in common than what we have in differences. And that's so true, you know, but you look at kind of the way that conversation went, and it was so incredibly polarizing. And that polarization, I think, is exactly what you mean by we have lost that ability to reason with either side, or kind of try and understand the perspective, not so that you can necessarily change someone's mind, but more so that you can come up with a solution. Do you know what I mean? Like, it seems so binary.
I think here's the challenging thing, right? Because I don't even know which way I lean, to be honest with you. I just think I just want to live in a place where everyone gets on as well as we can. People don't have to struggle to buy groceries.
Yeah.
People can have a roof over their head. I think when you boil politics down and you remove all of the nonsense online, most people want to go to work, come home, spend time with the people they love, have good health care, send their kids to school, keep a roof over their head, live their life. Like, it is that simple, right? And I think that anything that impedes people from doing that, if we can avoid it, let's avoid it. And I just think that's how simple it is. But because all these conversations, these nuanced conversations get added to the top of it, and everyone's screaming at each other, I feel like we've just lost the humanity in it.
But isn't it funny, like what you just said, I agree. I think most people do feel that way. But you're not seeing that content on social media, because if you were to make a video that said that, no one would engage with it.
No,
because it's the least outrageous thing ever. And people would be like, yeah, okay, yeah, sure, I agree. You know, there's no argument to that.
No, there isn't.
And so that's what I mean by, like, is this the chicken or the egg? Has the algorithm cottoned onto the fact that we are geared that way? Or are we now geared that way because the algorithm has kind of forced us down that path?
Questions I don't have answers
I don't have the answer either. I don't have the answer, but I think it's an interesting one to kind of think about leading into, you know, what we're about to go through in Australia with the election. Like, since we last spoke, actually, that would probably be the one thing that I have felt a shift in myself, is this ability to try and zoom out on situations now and not get so emotionally invested and not feel an emotional response to things like that. I'm trying to be more objective, and I'm trying to kind of distance myself from these things. And it's probably linked into the ADHD as well. You know, one of the main symptoms that you would have heard me speak about is that people with ADHD tend to struggle with emotional regulation. And I absolutely fell into that. So for me, being medicated now has given me that ability to kind of not be so outraged or hurt or feeling like I'm being criticized. You know, it's given me that ability to look at things a little bit more even-handedly.
Is that because when you have ADHD, it's harder to regulate it, or it's harder to understand why you're feeling emotional in the first place?
I think that would probably be a question that's above my pay grade to answer. Like, I feel like a psychiatrist would be best equipped. Essentially, the way I understand it is that we process dopamine in particular differently. There's a couple of different neurotransmitters, but particularly dopamine. And so dopamine is like kind of your reward, you know, your motivation chemical, right? It's the thing that makes you feel good. It's the thing that makes you feel motivated to get things started. In my understanding, that would be connected in some way, but I don't have a definitive answer for you.
Can I ask, so there's a guy that you've had on the series that hasn't been released yet, TJ Power.
Yes.
Who has been a recent discovery of mine. I don't know how I missed this fella for so long, but I was actually just singing his praises in the studio before you came in. Because I think that what TJ's done is he's a very relatable real-world character. He has a beautiful way of explaining things and putting things into simple terms. He's just released a book for anyone who's interested called The Dose Effect. DOSE being an acronym for dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And one of the things I love is that this guy on social media gives you very clear real-world examples of how you can balance yourself back out. And I wonder, as someone with ADHD, you can speak to your personal experience here and then maybe give us a more general answer too. How important have routines and practices become in trying to help you correct what your brain finds hard to do?
Do you want my personal experience or like the general consensus first? Because I've got both.
Give me your personal and then follow it up with the general.
I hate routine. I get so bored, like so incredibly bored. I was actually having this conversation last night with one of my best friends. One of our friends is doing a bodybuilding like competition in a couple of months. So she's doing the whole like measure everything and train X amount. It's incredibly routined. And I said, that would actually feel like a punishment for me. That would feel as though I was being punished for doing something wrong. Like either put me in jail or make me do that. They would be equal. So I find myself in a position where I know that that's how my brain is wired, but I need a certain amount of routine to kind of keep going in our society. You know, I know that I have to have work on set days now, and that work will be different each day, but it will be on a Monday, a Tuesday, and a Wednesday that we go into the studios, and it will be, you know, working from home the rest of the days. So routines is something I have always struggled with. But the thing that I've realized I struggle with more is trying to force myself to be okay with them. So that's been a part of the conversation that I've really enjoyed. And Mark Manson actually specifically spoke about this, is that realizing that about yourself, it gives you the license to just be a little bit easier on yourself and be like, oh, okay, routines are something that I just actually really struggle with. I don't enjoy them. I don't get the best out of myself when I'm routined. So how can I try and work with my brain rather than against it? There's this kind of joke in the ADHD community that we hate routines, but we have to have them because otherwise we don't get anything done. And it's kind of true. Like it's kind of true. Whether you do have ADHD or whether you're just a person who kind of seems that you lean a little bit more into the impulsive side of things, or you call yourself spontaneous, you could pick up and go to Africa tomorrow. I think what I have learned is that it's just better to figure out how you're wired and what works for you, rather than trying to force yourself into these routines. Because that's what I've been doing for my entire adult life, is like, I need to be more disciplined. I need to, have a set morning routine. And I'm just not wired that way. I just hate it. It makes me really miserable. Like, it makes me feel as though I'm failing at something that other people seem to be able to get right really easily.
This is a really interesting conversation, because I think that it kind of leans into productivity, right? Which is a bit of a buzzword at the moment and has been for a little while. And Tim Ferriss put up a beautiful article a while ago, and essentially the title was Efficient versus Effective.
Oh, I like that.
And I think productivity in its original form was designed to allow you to do the things that you need to do as effectively as possible in order to do less of the stuff that you don't want to do and free up more time for the things that fit you in your life. And somewhere along the timeline of Instagram hustle culture, productivity became do more for doing more's sake, because doing more looks good. And we've kind of all been fed this lie that the more you do, the more valuable everything you do becomes.
Yeah, there's a woman who wrote a book called Toxic Productivity. Isra Nazir is her name. And the most interesting that I found out of her book was that not only does productivity affect our work now, we seem to think of it in every sense. We think of productivity with our health and fitness. We think of it in our relationships. We think of it in our work life, obviously. Like, it actually is impacting so many different aspects of the way that we now view life, and we feel as though we have to be productive in every sense. And I don't know about you, but is there ever a moment where you're doing something and, it could just be because you want to do it for fun, and there's an element of guilt to it because it's like, oh, I could actually be spending my time in a more productive way. I found myself not even being able to watch a stupid show on TV unless I had my laptop in front of me and I was trying to get through, work's Instagram DMs or approving things in our Facebook group. Like, there was just never a moment that I felt I was able to go, I'm only doing this because I want to enjoy it.
I said to my mates last year, we moved into a new place. Soph and I, my sister and her partner, the four of us live together now. And
how's that going?
It's actually so good. Me and my sister fight like cat and dog.
Yeah.
We love each other dearly, but we just are both pests. So we just pester the shit out of each other, much to the amusement of Soph and to her partner Cal. But we've settled in really nicely. But we had friends of mine over, probably like the first month that we'd been in. Everyone came over, we had dinner and we played games and we had the best night. And I said to the boys next week when we caught up for coffee, that was the first time in I reckon a year or two that we've all just caught up without having to attach something productive to it.
Yeah.
We have a beautiful friendship, right? But it's always run, then coffee. It's always do this thing because we need to do that thing by the standard of how we like to live our day. But let's do it together so that we get a chance to catch up. It was really nice that you could all come to our house. We could eat dinner and play games and there was nothing productive about it.
Yeah.
There was nothing that made it fit kind of this noble pursuit of more or better or any of that. It was just friends being friends. And I know for some people that comes easier. And for some people, maybe that's a more natural way to live their life. I'm trying to do more of that.
Yeah.
But I find it really challenging.
So challenging. I realised at the start of this year, it was actually after chatting with TJ. So he and I recorded an episode in December. It will come out soon. And it was not a conversation we had on the mics, right? We were just chatting afterwards and we were kind of talking about like hobbies. And he was like, what are your hobbies? And I paused and I was like, oh, I like to swim. And then I like to do this and, I like to go and, go to the dog park and go for walks. And like when I'm walking, I listen to podcasts and that's how I feel like I really learn a lot. And he kind of stopped and asked me, he's like, but what do you do just for fun? And that was when I had that realization of everything that I have felt like I'm trying to do more of, or, it's all related to self-development or health or like, the swimming thing. Sure, I love it. It makes me feel good, but I do it because I know it's healthy for me. And I realized that I didn't have any goals for the entire year that were like outside of work or outside of, developing something that will benefit me through my career. And so I picked up Duolingo again. I'm currently on my 60th day streak, which is the longest I've ever stuck to anything.
What are you learning?
French, which I do have a bit of prior, I did some lessons when I was younger. But it was like that real realization, exact same as what you're talking about, of I haven't found myself doing things simply for pleasure in a really, really long time. And I need to find that again. I need to find the joy in things that are not connected to work or connected to, productivity or... Yeah, a little bit similar to this. Tanya Hennessy recently wrote an article for Body and Soul, and it was about the catch-up trap. And it was essentially how she had realized that our friendships now, particularly I think this affects women in their late 20s to 40s, we don't create new memories together anymore. We just go and we catch up for a coffee and we talk about what we've been doing. So I would say to you, this is what I've been up to. You would say to me, that's what I've been doing. And we play a tennis match of catching you up on my life, you catching me up on your life, and then we go away. And we actually aren't creating any new memories to talk about with each other. We're not going, hey, do you remember that time we went to that concert? Or do you remember that time we went and, I don't know, made pottery? We're in this catch-up trap where we just unload about our lives rather than actually making new things together and building that connection in our friendships from there on. And that article went bananas online, and it was sent into one of my group chats. And the next week we were doing an escape room, which I was like, okay, that's interesting thing for women in their 30s to be doing. I ended up having the best night ever. I was so bad at it. Everyone else was fantastic at this escape room, but I had so much fun, and I really realized that I need to lean way more into that this year.
Fuck, it's such a good point, Keish, because even as you're saying that, I'm thinking I'm going to pull on the thread and expand it a little bit and say that I think everyone's bad at that now.
Yeah, and it's not about making you feel more guilty about the fact that, because we have this inbuilt guilt when we're not being productive, because productivity used to be related to work, and that used to be kind of concealed to 9 to 5. And I don't know when specifically that changed. I think it probably has to do with the fact that, now we're connected through mobile devices and contactable at any hours. We're expected to work whenever we're needed to, rather than, these designated hours. And also, I don't want to say that as a bad thing, because my brain is wired that I need a work environment like that. I can't do a 9 to 5. I just wouldn't thrive, and it wouldn't be good for anybody. So I don't know when we lost it, but productivity has absolutely kind of engulfed every aspect of our life now. And I'm so sick of the guilt, even though I feel it massively. I feel the guilt when I'm not doing work, when I'm doing things that are kind of fun. Even coming and doing this podcast, in my head, I'm like, gosh, I just enjoy Brad so much. I love his podcast. I love what he's achieving with it. And as I parked my car, I was like, oh, how long do I need to put in the meter? Because I really want to be here and have this conversation, but I also need to get this done and this done and this done and this done today, and I need to get that edit done. It's just so second nature that I don't know how I'm going to get out of it.
It's challenging. So I had I want to share two things with you. So I had a couple insights off the back of last year that when I forced myself to reflect at the end of the year, I had big realizations about. One of which was I've been rushing through my life. I have so many good things in my life coming up at the moment. I'm getting married in August. We're traveling for 6 weeks. We're getting married in France, so the Duolingo thing, I probably need to spend some time there, right? And we're doing that with our family.
We can be friends and we can encourage each other.
And I'm so excited for that. And I'm trying to remind myself that the way that I'm currently living my life, if I live like that in the 6 weeks that we're overseas, it's going to pass me by and I'm going to wish it all over again. And I feel like it's become such a way that so many of us live our lives that even today, driving up here, I get here, similar to you, I park, I walk around the corner, I rush in the studio, I think, okay, when I finish here, I've got to get out of the studio, I've got to make sure that I get back to the car, then I've got to get home, and there's those few things that I need to do, and then I'll enjoy some hours with Soph, and then tomorrow I go to work, then tomorrow night I announce a fight night, and then I get up, and then the next day we've got that catch up. And I'm like, why am I trying to pack so much in for the sake of packing things in? And then one of the other big reflections was around this whole productivity idea. And there was a story that I heard last year. Someone come into our office like a, a sales trainer. And he told me a story that resonated so highly. So I have the statue of David on my arm. I had to check which arm, in my left arm. I seen the statue of David when I was in Florence. A gorgeous piece of art, right? It's sculpted so beautifully. It means so much to the people of that area. And this gentleman told me the story behind it. So originally, there was this, I think it was the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. Very fancy.
Sounds like you've been doing Italian on Duolingo.
They had instructed Michelangelo to take this large piece of stone and sculpt something that would hang from the ceiling of this building. He takes the stone away after spending a lot of time looking at it and monitoring it and doing as artists do, envisioning what they want to create. And after a long period of time comes back with this statue that is so magnificent and big that it was too heavy to hang from the ceiling. So they decided to place it at the entrance of this building. Now, once uncovered, this woman who had recognised what was once this piece of stone walks by and says to Michelangelo, in tears, "This is so beautiful. How have you created this statue from that piece of stone?" His response is just the most beautiful thing. He says, "I always seen David in the stone. I just had to remove everything that wasn't him." And I think, what a great analogy for life. How much of what we're packing into our very finite time is just unnecessary stone that doesn't really move the needle or doesn't really make us feel like life is any more fulfilling or beautiful than it was. How many of the things that I do, that I rush through, that I pack in for the sake of more, for the sake of efficiency, actually aren't effective? And so in order to do more of what you were saying, have genuine moments and memories and stuff that fills our cup, I actually think it's a matter of stripping away everything that is not necessary to then open up more space for life. And I'm just not that good at that. I used to be. I used to be so good at it. And don't get me wrong, I'm great at appreciating my people. I'm great at spending the time there. But I want to spend more time present there.
I feel like it's a hard balance, especially when I know you personally, and I know what you're doing and how hard you're working to create a life for you and Soph, and to create a podcast that is fulfilling and makes you feel a sense of purpose. And so again, it is hard when that's the priority and you want to work so hard to create something, because if we were taking my advice of like, just do things that bring you joy and for no other reason, well, then we wouldn't be succeeding in our careers, we wouldn't be growing in our careers. So I do think that there is a sense of like finding that balance, which is something I've never been good at. And by the sounds of it, I don't know if you've been good at the balance either, because I know how hard you work and I know how much you invest in what you want to create, and there is a reason behind it. So I don't know if it's just about kind of trying to have a little bit more self-awareness of both sides of the coin, rather than, criticizing yourself for being one way more so than the other. I don't know what the exact answer is. For myself, I just want to try and be a little bit more aware of it so that I can catch myself in the moments where I'm too far in, either side or either direction. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
You've got to give ourselves a little more grace.
Yeah, I think you do.
The way that you would other people.
I mean, I know how hard you work. And so hearing you kind of be like, oh, I've lost that balance and whatever, you might have, but you also are doing it for the right reasons. You're working hard to do something and to make something that will benefit you in the future.
Let me ask you this. So I had... for the second time, similar to you, a second time guest on the show just a couple of weeks ago, Katarina Kuhn. She's a neuroscientist, and we had a lovely conversation. I always really enjoy my chats with Kat because she's so much smarter than I am, much as all the guests that come on this show are.
Except for me.
No, I wouldn't say that.
Except for me.
If anyone's listening to our conversation, they're nodding their head. One thing that's interesting is she talks about the 5 primal emotions of human behaviour being rank, guard, seek, play, and care. And I think that when I think about yourself or people who are, everybody embodies all of those five primal emotions, but I guess what is typically seen in people who have ADHD as this tendency for play or novelty, as you've mentioned a couple times. And I know that was a big part of your chat with Mark Manson. But also this idea of seek, like the curiosity of what else is there. I wonder whether there is a higher, we'd have to look at some science, and I'm not expecting an answer from you here on this, but whether there is a link between people who are high seek, high play and people who have an ADHD diagnosis.
I can only speak from my personal experience, but I would assume that there would likely be one. The reasons behind it, I mean, again, I can only speak from my own experiences, but when I was going through the diagnosis process and they were talking about impulsivity, there were a lot of questions about financial impulsivity. So like whether you're geared towards gambling was really the question that they kind of get to the bottom of. And I've never been that way. I was very fortunate to grow up with very good money values. I've always been a good saver, and working in our industry, you have to have a rainy day pot because our jobs can, and I was made redundant overnight before, those things can be taken away from you very quickly. So you
Wish
kind
I
of
heard
have
that 2 years ago.
You kind of have to have that safety net to some degree. So initially I was like, no, I'm not very impulsive at all. And they ask you a lot of questions about drug seeking. And I was like, no, I've never really had a problem with drugs. I mean, got to be careful what you say, but it's never been something that I've fallen into a dark hole amongst. And, gratefully. And then I had more conversations about impulsivity and more conversations about curiosity. And I think that those two things are quite linked, because if you are someone who is really, really curious and you want to find answers about something, you will really seek it out. You'll be a dog with a bone and you will want to get to the bottom of it. And that's how I've been my entire life. If there was something that I was wanting to know more about, it would be absolute tunnel vision. This is what I want to do. This is where my attention is focused and directed towards. So in my own personal experience, I would assume that, this increased propensity for things like novelty and impulsivity that is associated with characteristics of ADHD. And again, that's all related to dopamine. That's all because we process dopamine in a slightly different way. I would say that we probably would have higher rates of play and curiosity.
It's interesting because when you mention that, right, like that deep curiosity.
Yeah.
I guess what a lot of people would then associate, correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding, I've got a few mates who have ADHD, one in particular who's a very close mate of mine. And I know that his deep tunnel curiosity on something can then just be completely shifted to something else.
They call it hyperfocus.
Hyperfocus.
Yeah. So it can be the type of, there's a lot of jokes in the ADHD community that you'll get a new hobby and you'll buy every single thing to do with the hobby, and then you'll do it for 3 weeks and you will never look at that stuff again. And which is funny, and that's kind of the negative side of it. But I've really been interested in flipping it and looking at the positive side of it. And apparently there is a higher percentage of people who are entrepreneurial who have ADHD, because we have a greater capacity, I guess, to take risks, because we are impulsive in that way. And so we take risks in situations where other people wouldn't. And sometimes those risks pay off. Sometimes those are really, really good qualities to have in someone who wants to be, a business owner or a creator or artistic or even a sports person. Like there's quite a lot of people in professional sport. And it can be because we kind of get that dog with a bone mentality, and we're willing to kind of be a bit more impulsive than what other people might be. And that can be a benefit as well.
Do you think that, I guess it's kind of like a barbell, right? Like there's probably examples of where that risk leads to incredible reward, but on then the other complete end of the spectrum where it can be disastrous.
Yeah.
And there's this huge gap in the middle. Do you find it hard to navigate that gap? Because, you're doing so incredibly well in your field, right? But to do well in anything requires such consistency and long-term focus. Do you have to battle against that all the time?
All the time. And Mark Manson specifically said this, like, I get bored very quickly, and that can be disastrous if I don't have something to kind of, oh God, what a privileged thing to say. Like, I get bored easily, so I have to find a way to make myself not be bored, but it is the truth. I've had to kind of, and that's why I wanted to create Cloud. Honestly, it's because I want people to know that if you are wired this way, it can be really bad. And a lot of the ADHD conversation is, this is what you're bad at. I mean, the word deficit is in the fucking title of it, you know, like attention deficit. It's not a nice thing to think about yourself. And so I kind of wanted to show, like, if you are wired that way, this is how things could be really, really bad. But this is actually how you can try and pivot that and have it be a good thing. Again, we're bordering on this toxic positivity of like, don't worry, there's silver linings to everything and you can make your life great. But the reality is if you're wired that way and you don't hear about the positive ways that you can kind of make your brain work, and you only hear about the negative side, you're going to think that you're defective. You're going to think that you're not going to be able to achieve anything. And again, not just in the traditional element of success and achievement. Achievement for me, and a massive thing that I feel I have achieved in the past year and a half, is emotional regulation. And it's actually being more present in my relationship. So that to me is success, you know?
And do you feel a greater sense of inner peace?
Hugely. And I wish it came through ways that weren't medicinal, because I have the fear that if I'm to stop meds, that might go away. I'm kind of still battling with that. I'm not at I'm not at nirvana with that yet, but I'm trying to make the other things in my life work alongside my brain so that I can feel more and more inner peace.
What are the ways that you feel you've been negatively impacted by your now new understanding of ADHD when you look back on the last couple of years of your life in particular?
So there's this thing called rejection sensitive dysphoria. I don't know if, whoever's listening, if you have heard of it. It seems like a pretty hectic name for something, but I was completely unaware of this up until my diagnosis, basically. It is essentially this really heightened emotional reaction to criticism or perceived chance of rejection. So a lot of people with ADHD do have rejection-sensitive dysphoria, but it's also associated with conditions like anxiety, depression, bipolar, trauma, complex trauma as well. And that is something that I feel I have really learned to navigate a lot better, because I wasn't aware of the fact that when I felt things, I always felt as though I felt things to such a large magnitude. And that would be the high highs, but it would also be the really, really low lows. And so becoming aware of the fact that that's how I was made me realize, like, oh, okay, maybe I need to unpack, what I'm perceiving as attacks on who I am as a person, or the negative things that I believe about myself, that kind of self-identity story, that narrative that you tell yourself, like you're really hopeless because you can't achieve this, or like you're really hopeless because you struggle so much to pay attention in a conversation with someone, and you have to keep reminding yourself, like, oh, get yourself back, be more present, because you're thinking about 10 other things that are kind of going on. Finding out about rejection-sensitive dysphoria was the most enlightening thing for me, because I realized that I do have this increased emotional kind of wavelength, I guess. And I was able to kind of be softer on myself and reduce that wavelength. I don't know if I'm giving the analogy in a good way, but that was kind of the main thing that has changed for me. I don't know if that answers your question. What was the question?
It
Sorry.
It does. What's probably the most negative impact you've been able to realise?
Sorry.
Can I say something quickly? It's interesting. I don't know how you resonate with this, but I assume you would. You mentioned there around like these ideas of beliefs, right? And I think it's, it can sound a bit woo-woo, right? And
I love a bit of woo-woo.
Yeah, I always say, I was actually laughing with the boys in the studio before. I always say I'm not a woo-woo kind of guy, but then I say that so often that maybe I am.
I think there's a place for both.
There is a place for both.
Yeah.
And I think, the poles are kind of woo-woo and then science. But I recently came across this girl online who put the science to kind of a feeling that I had spoken out about on the podcast before. Her social media name, I don't know her surname, but her social media tag is M on the brain, like EM as in Emily or Emma, whatever her name is. She's a neuroscientist. And she was speaking about the science of belief. And she spoke about how there is the placebo effect in medicine, and how the placebo effect is actually accounted for in the efficacy of a drug because of its neurochemical effect.
Yeah, it's really powerful.
Really powerful. She spoke about the inverse, though, the nocebo effect, and how the negative things that we feel about ourselves also have a reaction and are recognised by the brain. One thing I spoke about in the podcast a while ago is just after last year, probably the more rushed and hectic my life became, I actually found that negative beliefs started to come into the fold. And I think it's just holding myself to a sometimes unrealistic standard and not feeling like I was meeting those, or putting a certain expectation or pressure or timeline on the things that I wanted to achieve, started to elicit some limiting beliefs. And one of the realizations was limiting beliefs absolutely do not serve you in any way, shape or form, because your imperfect nature as a human being means that you are guaranteed to find a reason to confirm a limiting belief at any one given point in your life. Great example you just said. I think this is what you just said. If you keep telling yourself that you're useless, or that you can't do something, or that you're not useful or not practical, you will make a mistake one day that therefore then confirms that belief.
Yeah, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
Correct,
yeah.
Right? And then your behaviour and your actions follow that belief, and then the results just continue to confirm themselves. And so, it's so interesting what you talk about there, that rejection-sensitive dysphoria, because I think if you're heightened and more likely to feel that, you probably then go and self-sabotage a little bit more.
I see it more like some people talk about in terms of like a cycle, but I see it more in terms of a spiral. So, and I think that relates to what you were saying. Like if you have that belief about yourself and then you're wired in a certain way to like take on more criticism and feel that criticism very deeply, the next thing that you believe about yourself means that you're going to believe the criticism even more, and it spirals downwards rather than a cycle of kind of coming back to, what would be deemed as normal. But yeah, sorry, I think I kind of half answered the question. I think the worst thing about it was that I realized how much I believed criticisms throughout, my entire life. And there was a study done back quite a while ago, I think it was from like 2010, and they estimated that kids with undiagnosed ADHD would hear 20,000 more negative criticisms of their behavior by the time they were 10. So if you kind of think about, you've heard that much more criticism about your behavior, you then think about the narrative that you tell yourself, and then you think about extending that into your teen and adult life. It's not surprising that I think criticism is something that a lot of us tend to struggle with. We're told, sit up, pay attention, stop interrupting people. Why are you doing that? Get down. You're off with the fairies, like all of that kind of thing. They will seem very insignificant as a one-off, but when you're hearing them 20,000 times by the time you're 10, it adds up. And I think that can really add to the narrative that we do make about ourselves. And again, this is not specific to ADHD. This is for everybody, I think if we are taking on certain things that people in relationships have said to us, or if we're taking on things that our boss, who might just be an asshole, is saying to us, and we kind of start to create that narrative, it's hard to break yourself out of it when you don't have much evidence of the contrary, when that's all you're hearing, and you don't have the self-belief or the the ability to zoom out and see things a little bit more objectively, then you do start to believe those things about yourself, and the spiral begins.
What are some of the aha moments been throughout recording the show? Because I know how, for people who don't know you, who are listening to this or watching this, you're so well researched, and you are so thoughtful in the way that you go about anything that you do. So I'm sure that there would have been a lot you learned in the researching process. But when you actually sat down, you're recording the podcast and speaking to so many brilliant people, were there any moments in recording where you're like, oh, wow, that has helped me make sense of something?
There were so many of them. Most we have spoken about in this conversation, I think, because it's like so front of mind for me now. The rejection sensitive dysphoria was huge. That was the biggest light bulb I experienced. I was like, oh, I've always felt like I felt things in a different way to how most people seemed to. I was always a deep cat, like an emotional cat. I felt things a lot. Hearing so many people, Sabrina Zohar in particular, she's a podcaster from America. She she's in the relationship space predominantly and entrepreneurial. She's a business owner as well. And hearing her experiences, I was like, are you in my brain? Like, what is happening here? Hear Mark Manson talk about the way he structures his workday. That was when I was like, oh, I have to stop forcing myself to try and do things in the way that I'm told to do them by experts, you know, the productivity experts. I need to kind of take that, not with a grain of salt, but I need to go, okay, that might work for people whose brains are wired that way. I don't work like that. So I need to pivot and I need to try something else. That was a big thing. Talking with TJ Power about certain ways that I can seek out dopamine in healthy ways, not in ways that are bad for us. That was particularly interesting. There was this one moment where I was telling him I've been doing ice baths. I'm a bit of a biohack bro in that way. So again, I'm very science-based, but just like you, I like to dabble in the woo-woo because why not? Who's it hurting, you know? The ice bath thing, I was telling him how I've been so proud of myself because, you know, I've gotten up to 4 minutes in, I think it's like 6 degrees or 5 degrees. And I'm like, yeah, I've built up to that, really proud of myself. And I realized that in an ice bath I went into in Bali, I was the only person in. I was in there for much longer than everybody else, but I had a podcast in. And he was like, oh, Keeshia, I'm really sorry to tell you, but it's not just the physical benefits you get from it. It's also about like the pleasure pain situation. And by you having a podcast and then distracting yourself from the pain that you're experiencing, your dopamine high isn't going to be as high. And I was like, damn it. I thought I'd hacked my way into being able to achieve that. So there are some fun things that I learned along the way like that as well. You know, he's really encouraging of not having your phone next to you in bed because you're going to wake up in the morning, first thing you're going to do is get that immediate scroll on. That's exactly what I do. I'm really working on that. So they've been big things. They've been big, like self-identity, the narratives I tell myself, the bad things I thought about myself that were actually symptomatic of a condition rather than personality traits. They're the big things. Then there's been a lot of little things that have just made my life more enjoyable and more fun and kind of about what we were speaking about earlier. I'm trying to find the pleasure in a way that's not connected to anything other than pleasure and through healthy mechanisms, not through, you know, bad ways.
let me ask you something. I can see how much this has brought you joy, purpose, fulfillment, all of those really good things about life. This is a 10 episode series. How on earth at the end of, like, have you filmed all of them?
Yeah.
So you've filmed all of them, right? Now you've probably got some of the post-film, early release joy that's seeping in at the moment because it's all real and new and people are starting to hear this. Once all 10 episodes are aired, how on earth are you going to go back to not being in the creator's seat?
Look, I feel like that itch is scratched a lot because I host on Life Uncut a lot. But again, working out what works for my brain, if this was going to be an ongoing thing, I don't think I would be able to have as much joy in the project of it because I am wired that way to be like, okay, what's next? You know, what's next? I'm not particularly good at being present and stopping and smelling the roses. That's something that we do need to try and stop and smell the roses more, and I am aware of that. But I've kind of seen it that I'm like, cool, this is a 10-part thing. I can sink my teeth in. I can hyper-focus on it for a couple of months, get it all out there, feel amazing about that. And then maybe we start to have conversations about, you know, what's the next one that we're doing? And I don't want to force myself to be that way so that I'm not enjoying the joy of this because right now I'm really feeling a sense of purpose from it. And so I want to sit in that and I want to be present in that. And then once the 10 episodes are done, we can start thinking about conversations of what might be next. But yeah, I haven't let myself do it yet.
It is very true. It's exciting. I guess it's the balance between something we talk about in here a little bit, ambition and appreciation.
Yeah.
And trying to walk the line between the two.
Every single thing that I've realised, especially in this conversation with you, it's all about balance, and I'm never very good at getting that balance right, but I'm working on it. That's the goal.
Can I tell you something funny? So you've probably noticed over the course of us being connected on socials, but used to be more frequently every 6 weeks or so, I'd have two of my best mates on the podcast, Joe and Ty. And we had this very in-depth conversation one day about balance. Like, it almost took up 2 hours of the podcast. And right at the end of the episode, Ty, who's a very pragmatic, straight down the line kind of guy, just goes, you know, there's another name for this. And I was like, what? And he goes, yin and yang, brother. And I was like, it could have been done in two words, you know. Could have been done in 2 words. But it's so true, because I think
love a yap.
Yeah, we love a yap. And I just think it's part of the human condition, is how on earth does one achieve balance when you exist in a world like we do today? It's much harder to do so, you know. And there are times where I feel, man, I wish that in order to do what I really loved, it didn't have to involve the social media stuff. And there's parts of social media I love. Like, I probably rag on it a little bit more than is necessary, just because I think there's so many challenging parts of it.
I think it's also becoming more challenging. And that's related to what we spoke about with the whole outrage culture algorithm stuff. It's actually because it is becoming more geared that way. And I think that that's why people like us are like, oh, I'm feeling sick from this. I'm actually feeling gross about it, even though to do what we do, we have to be involved in this world. We wouldn't have podcasts if there wasn't social media. No one would know about listening, you know? So it's a bit of you got to feed the beast as well. But yeah, no, I very much align with you on that, where it's exhausting. And I think that if things continue to go, and I know I sound a little bit hectic when I talk about this and I sound very negatively geared about it, but I actually am genuinely worried that if we continue to go on this path, with the algorithm being the way that it is, it will be a particularly negative experience.
I was saying this to Soph last night. We were talking about this just as we were going to bed. Probably not the conversation to have before you go to sleep. But I was saying that somewhere along the line we forgot that Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, any one of these media companies and applications are a business owned by human beings who want to profit. We can't be confused to think that Instagram was created to make our lives better. It was created for somebody to benefit from a genius idea. It just so happens that this idea was so genius that it's been woven into our life in a way in which we don't feel like we can cut it loose. It's like it's literally, we exist in it. It's become a skin for us in so many ways that, you know, I can't remember who it was I was listening to during the week who was talking about at one point in time, Zuck sat down at Facebook and said, we're kind of losing a little bit of attention and enjoyment on the platform here. I have a theory that if we make it easier for people to connect with new people on Facebook, people will want to spend more time on the platform. You know, his theory happened to be right. The same way that Instagram has followed the suit of TikTok and gone, if people can get viral easier, they'll have a greater incentive to create more. Now, I've had a real frustration this week, and this is me being really honest. Just over the last month, I feel like everything on the podcast has just gone a step back from my social media perspective.
Same with us.
Right?
And having this conversation last night, I was like, what on earth is going on with the algorithm right now?
Really frustrated.
I'm talking like, 10% of normal viewership.
Yeah. Like
I don't know why.
It's really hurt me on social media. I'm like, man, I've released, and I feel bad for the guests because I'm like, I've had some beautiful people on the show who have got such amazing things to say. And I feel like I've done them an injustice by not connecting them with an audience. And then I stop and I start to read up about it and I can see all the things that are changing in the platform. And the idea behind this is you get frustrated, you create more, you make your videos better. And I think there's a beauty in that because it's also, this is me being fucking optimistic, is if I get better at creating, I can potentially engage with an even greater audience. But then you have to, Guy Ritchie says, I fucking love Guy Ritchie, he's my dream guest for this show. They say, don't hate the player, hate the game. Don't hate the game, you're in it. You got to figure out how to make it work for you somehow because they're likely not going to change because of the conversation that we're having on the podcast.
It's so true, but I don't want to fall into being the person who deliberately creates outrage content, you know, like, and I don't want to be the person, we joke about it in Life Uncut where we're like, we're not doing vulnerability porn, which is, we have many moments where guests cry. I had one myself on the first episode of Cloud. I know that if I cut that as a social clip and put that out. I know it would have gone 10 times bigger than what the actual one that I cut and put out. But I was like, I'm not doing it. I'm not buying into this. There is a certain point where we have to go, I'm not going to keep playing this game. Will I be, will I be affected by it in a negative way? Yes. I'm okay with my content getting less views if it makes me feel as though I'm proud of putting it out. I'm not buying into this bullshit where I'm deliberately baiting people and causing them to get angry because it will grow a following. Like, I'm just not, I refuse. Yeah.
It's the constant battle, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a constant battle with being okay with being able to put your head on the pillow at night and sleep easy because you know that you've done things the right way.
Yeah, and we've got to bend down to the tech bros in some ways, but I know my limits now. I know where I will stop.
This is very true. Hey, it's been so nice to catch up.
It's been so nice to catch up. I'm sorry I've missed our last coffee catch-ups when you've been in Sydney for X amount of time. I'm in Sydney for half an hour.
I do want to scratch that comment. It's been so nice to make a new memory because I think it's so easy, as you alluded to that article before, to say, let's just catch up, let's do a podcast. But I genuinely do enjoy our chats and always feel a great sense of satisfaction for being able to sit and riff on ideas with you and chat with you. And I think the last time we had a proper chat, I was sitting in my car in between appointments of work and you were like, oh, I'm really nervous. I'm interviewing Mark Manson tomorrow. And just a reminder of how well that turned out. So excited for you, excited to continually see the success of Cloud and everything that you do from here on out. Appreciate you coming around.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being such a cheerleader for me.
Pleasure.
A lot of this space it's competitive and, again, related to algorithms, you got to fight for that attention, right? We live in an attention economy and you have always been someone who very genuinely cheerleads for the people around you. It's more rare than people might realize in this industry and I'm super appreciative of it.
Been my absolute pleasure.